Your Excellency, Mr. Landsbergis, dear organizers, thank you very much for organizing this event. Can you hear me? Yeah. Once I was told that it's a very symbolic gesture that when we start to speak, we first arrange microphone, even if it works, it doesn't matter. So I would speak about this great synagogue of Vilnius and the city of Vilnius. 100 years ago, in the beginning of the 20th century, 100 synagogues existed in this city. Some of them were very small and occupied a single room, while others were large. Some of them were situated in narrow lines and courtyards of the old Jewish quarter and hardly could be found without help, while others stood in the central streets and were visible to all. The majority of those synagogues were demolished either during World War II or during the Soviet occupation, and only eight buildings are preserved today. The question, therefore, is why so much attention is drawn not to those 8 buildings, and even not to the impressive functioning synagogue at Pylimo Street, not to the 100 synagogues which do not exist anymore, but to the great synagogue of Vilnius. The answer is not complicated. The great synagogue was not simply a place where people came to pray to God, not simply a place where people conducted religious rituals. It was the symbolic representative building of the local Jewish community, and to remind you again and again, the local community was one of the most important communities of Europe from the 17th century and until the Holocaust. The great synagogue was first and foremost a symbol, the sacred place belonging to the entire community in defining it as a holy community. Even the worshiping in that synagogue had symbolic dimension, because praying there and not elsewhere in a small synagogue at your home or next to your home had meaning. There is a story about one of the community leaders in the early 19th century. His name was Mishulam Zalman Urison. I'm sure that nobody remembers him today, and its name says nothing to most of you. So this Urison was rich enough to have his own cloisters, a small synagogue, at his own house, as it was customary among the Jewish elite. Nonetheless, every day he went to pray to the great synagogue, and our source stresses that he did it, I quote, even in winter. Winter matters not only because for the elderly people it was hard to walk through snow, but mainly because there was no heating in the great synagogue. One can only imagine how chilly it was there during the morning prayer service. Mishulam Zalman Urison not only prayed in the great synagogue, he watched that people wouldn't speak on secular matters while in the synagogue. Thus we see that for Urison and for other Jews, the great synagogue was a special one, the special one. It differed from other hundreds of synagogues and occupied the most prominent place in their view of the city and of its Jewish community. In Yiddish, the great synagogue was usually called die Stadtschule, that means the city synagogue. This name clearly implies that the synagogue was considered to be the synagogue of the city, while all others being synagogues of private people, religious or professional associations of various groups or various neighborhoods. As a good indicator of the importance of the great synagogue for local Jews is the legend, which tells how the Karaites from Trakai, once upon a time, succeeded to take over the great synagogue. After that, the Karaites dug a secret underground tunnel from Trakai directly to the Vilnius Great Synagogue to be able to come and pray there. In other words, Jews It's a Jewish legend. Jews considered the Great Synagogue to be so important that even the Trakai Karaites would be willing to appropriate it and, via a special tunnel, to walk 30 kilometers by foot to pray in this sacred space. I brought this legend not because I believe in it, but because such a legend stresses the significance with which the Vilnius Jews invested their Great Synagogue. We may even say that its symbolic and representative function was more important than its function as a place of religious worship. You can pray elsewhere, but in the Great Synagogue is the place where you publicly display the prayer for the Russian emperor. You can pray elsewhere, but when the president of a country comes to the Jewish community, you organize a festive meeting in the Great Synagogue. You can pray elsewhere, but only in the Great Synagogue you put some objects on display as a testimony to the ancient origins of the community, as reflected in its most sacred and most prominent place of worship. When you want to represent the Vilnius Jewish community in a visual way, the Great Synagogue would be one of the most prominent subjects and symbols depicted by famous artists and photographers. In the remaining time, I would like to present you a short sketch of the history of the Great Synagogue and its continuous dialogue with the city of Vilnius. Since it is not the first and not the second and not the third time that I speak about the Great Synagogue in Vilnius, I apologize to those of you who have heard already some of my ideas. So, the first synagogue in Vilnius was apparently erected in 1573 on a plot exempted from the municipal jurisdiction because the city of Vilnius, as many royal and grand ducal towns, had the right de non tolerantis Judaeis. The synagogue was plundered by the local people 20 years later in 1592. Next year, the Jewish community got a privilege from the king and grand duke, which allowed Jews to settle in the city, to have a synagogue and a cemetery, and to engage in trade. We don't know if this privilege simply reassured the existing situation, or it meant the erection of a new building for the worship. The synagogue was again attacked by the Christian people in 1606. In 1633, Vilnius Jews received a new privilege, which explicitly permitted them to build a new synagogue, I quote, on the same plot where it stands now, unquote. Thus, we may suppose that this great synagogue, as we know it, was built according to this privilege. The architectural style of the building does not contradict this date. What is interesting, however, is the relation of the building that we know from photographs and the previous synagogue. Was that previous synagogue wooden or masonry? Was it demolished completely or parts of it were included in the new building? All these questions could not be solved without archaeological excavations, and I hope very much that the current excavation by Dr. John Seligman will bring us answers. Until the end of the excavations, we will continue to consider that the Great Synagogue was built in 1633. 2 years later, in 1635, it was plundered again by the Christian people of Vilnius. The complaint about this looting is the best inventory of synagogue belongings we have from the 17th century. It describes 18 Torah scrolls, numerous silver candelabra, Hanukkah menorahs, precise Torah ark curtains, etc., etc. As we just have seen, the Great Synagogue was looted several times in the 16th and 17th century. In other words, it was the focal point of a conflict between the Christian and Jewish population of the city. When Christians, or some of them, considered Jewish presence, Jewish behavior, or Jewish economic activities inappropriate, they turned their anger not only against individual Jews and Jewish houses, but also against the synagogue, which represented for them all Jews as a collective, as a corporation. Looting the synagogue, besides obvious material gains, was a symbolical assault on the symbol of the Jewish community. Although the great synagogue was the main public building of the Jews, it was barely visible. The building stood in the middle of a Jewish quarter. It didn't face any street. Such situation fully reflected the structure of medieval and early modern city, where public spaces were not necessarily open to all. German Lutheran Church, built in the mid-16th century, was erected according to the same scheme and same idea. The large and impressive building is hidden inside the quarter in a courtyard. Protestants, as well as Jews, were a minority in the Catholic city, and their public representation was hidden behind regular dwelling houses. In contrast to the Great Synagogue, this church survived the war and the communist regime, but it is hidden so well that many people who spent their whole life in Vilnius never saw it. Back to our synagogue. The interior of the synagogue, as we know it from the photographs and other depictions, was completed in the middle of the 18th century. After several fires which damaged the synagogue, the richest and most influential person in the community, Yehuda ben Eliezer, donated a shield which decorated the Torah Ark and an elaborate bima. I hope that Dr. Sergei Kravtsov will speak about the symbolism of this structure in his paper. In the early 19th century appeared the most prominent and remembered part of the Great Synagogue, a neoclassical gable above its eastern facade. We don't know when exactly it was built, and the dating is based on its architectural style. We don't know why it was built and which function it intended to serve. Therefore, we may suppose that this very prominent gable was referring to the Vilnius Cathedral, rebuilt in the neoclassical style in 1783. In the cathedral, the portico is an integral part of the classicist style, and it stresses the main solemn entrance to the building. In the Great Synagogue, the gable with columns was added to the existing structure and has no practical functions. It seems that its main goal was stressing the importance of the synagogue and equating it with the most important Christian building in the city. Another point of reference for the synagogue gable could be the new building of Vilnius City Hall, finished in 1799. Again, it's a classicist building with a prominent portico, and later I will return to this idea of to the parallel between the synagogue and the city hall. Thus, although hidden in the middle of a Jewish quarter, the synagogue was in constant dialogue with the city of Vilnius and its landmarks. It's impossible to be a king all alone. To be a king, you need a court, which, as it said, plays the king. The same is with the Great Synagogue. It cannot exist alone, and it is surrounded by an entire complex of communal buildings and smaller prayer houses. This compound is called in Yiddish Schulhof, or in Lithuanian Yiddish Schulhof, the courtyard of the synagogue. The Schulhof is like the entourage of the king. As the real center of the Jewish community, the Great Synagogue housed all kinds of communal institutions. And first of all, the building of the Great Synagogue included the offices of the community, so-called Kahalstub. Kahal was autonomous in its internal affairs and ruled over all Jews residing in the city. Thus, the building of the Great Synagogue was a kind of city hall for the Jewish residents of Vilnius, while Christians were subjected to the real city hall, which we just saw. How can you run a community if there is no possibility to employ violence against the transgressors of rules? Therefore, next to the Kahalstub, which was situated here in this part of the building, and it's in destroyed form, it's seen much better. So next to the communal office, there was a jail and the kune, a collar which a guilty person was put in and shamed in front of the entire community. The kune of the Vilnius synagogue didn't survive, so I can show you a similar object from synagogue in Przysłucha in Poland. Other communal institutions included the communal well situated behind the great synagogue in the second courtyard, the communal outhouse, it's an important institution for the courtyard where hundreds and thousands of people gathered together, and communal bathhouse with a mikveh. So this building. I believe that John Seligman will tell us more about the mikveh that he found during the last season of excavations. The community also owned shops standing in front of the synagogue. So here are the shops. And it was easy for community to control them in this place. And when, in the late 19th century, the library of Mtityahu Strashun was given to the community, it was also placed in the vicinity of the Great Synagogue. And the library was situated here on the second floor. In the age when religion was retreating before culture, the library was perceived as a new temple, and therefore it was very clever to place it next to the main sacred space of the community connected to the religion, so it was organized together the religion and the culture. As well, there were numerous small synagogues around the Great Synagogue. The oldest one is the Old Clois. It was intended for studying of sacred text in convenient conditions. In contrast to the Great Synagogue, it had an oven and it was warm in winters. And where people were engaged in studying the Torah. And when we say study of the Torah, it's not about biblical texts, but it's about studying Talmud and its commentaries. And the study of the Torah is so important that every community supported Talmudic scholars whose obligation was just to study the whole day, or sometimes even to organize the study process for 24 hours, 7 days a week. Without Torah being studied, the world might collapse. The new Clois next to the old was built for the same purpose. It was funded by the above-mentioned Yehuda ben Eliezer. Here, the importance of the donation was not only in the building itself, but in a special fund which allowed payments for the scholars studying in the Clois. In other words, the Clois was a kind of academy of science or an academic institute where people received salaries for studying sacred texts. I wish all of us could receive money just for learning interesting subjects. However, sometimes the Cloisniks, those who seated in the Clois, were supposed to sleep in the Clois during the week, to sleep on the wooden benches there. And this I don't wish for us. The Clois of the Vilna Gaon was organized in a similar way. The community paid salary to the Gaon in order to allow him to sit and study without thinking about livelihood, and it paid scholarships for Gaon students to allow them to study with their master. This Clois was also situated near the Great Synagogue, since no other place was suitable for such an important activities. In the late 19th century, the Clois of the Gaon, completely reconstructed, became not less sacred and important than the Great Synagogue. However, it missed the symbolic meaning interwoven in the Great Synagogue. Theoretically, the Great Synagogue was intended for the entire community. In practice, however, there were splinter groups who preferred to pray on their own. One such group we have already discussed, the Torah scholars who studied and prayed in their cloisen. The Vilna Gaon didn't pray with the whole community. He prayed with his own students in his own place. Another splinter group was the Hevra Kadisha, burial society. The members of Burial Kadisha didn't dig graves and didn't bring dead bodies to the cemeteries. For that, they have a special rank in the society. The real members of Hevra Kadisha were the richest and most influential people in the community, and it was a kind of elite club. And they also preferred to be separate from the entire community, separate but not far away, being just next to the great synagogue. Other groups who established themselves in the synagogue compound were from the opposite, lower strata of the community. Painters, and here is the painters' synagogue, and workers, and here was the workers' synagogue. They had their buildings behind the building of a great synagogue. Another group that had its prayer house near the great synagogue were Hasidim. Although Vilnius was the center of Litvak, anti-Hasidic Jews, two Hasidic prayer houses were situated in the Schulhof in the 19th century. The first one belonged to the Lithuanian Hasidim of Kaidan of Slonium, and we can see it here. Part of it was captured on photograph, probably here in the second floor. And in a separate prayer house belonged to the Chabad Hasidim. Placement of Hasidic prayer houses in the communal Schulhof was a clear sign to the end of the struggle between Hasidim and their opponents, and it legitimized the Hasidic way of worship. All in all, there were 12 synagogues in the Vilnius Schulhof, including the Great Synagogue. Nobody designed the Schulhof in this way, but the number 12 has a lot of symbolism in the Jewish culture. 12 tribes of Israel, 12 zodiac signs, 12 months on the year, and each month, the first day of each month is a minor holiday in the Jewish tradition. So, and all these 12 synagogues were united by the fact that they stood around the great synagogue. Notwithstanding the fact that Jews spread to all parts of Vilnius, the great synagogue and its compound remained the center and the symbol of the community until the Holocaust. Surprisingly enough, the Nazis didn't damage the great synagogue on purpose. While in Germany they put the majority of synagogues on fire in 1838 during the so-called Reichskristallnacht, where it was not necessary. In summer 1941, the Nazis started already mass murder of Jews, and therefore there was no need to symbolic murder in the form of desecration of Jewish places of worship. Thus, the great synagogue and the Schulhof, in contrast to the people, survived World War II with relatively minor damage. The testimony for it not only numerous photographs, like here, but the parts of Torah Ark which could be seen today in the Vilna Gaon Jewish State Museum. After the war, those Jews who returned to Vilnius paid special attention to the Great Synagogue. It was not suitable for worship, and the functioning synagogue was established at the Pilima Street because that synagogue was not part of the ghetto and was not damaged. But the Schulhof remained the imagined center. On May 13th, 1945, the burial procession with desecrated Torah scrolls entered the Schulhof on its way to the Užupis cemetery, and speeches were delivered in front of the great synagogue from the porch of the Gaon Clois. The short-lived Jewish museum established in Vilnius immediately after the war tried to protect the great synagogue and to repair it. For the museum activists, it was the most important architectural landmark of the Vilnius Jewish community, which has to be preserved for the future generations. However, the ruins of the great synagogue and the entire Schulhof were razed down in the 1950s. In a socialist Soviet city, there was no place for the material symbol of the Jewish community. Jews were barely visible in the Soviet Union, and the external signs of their presence were not welcome. The great synagogue disappeared from the city and from city maps. After the restoration of the independence of Lithuania in 1990, the place of the great synagogue was marked again, although in a modest way. And I am very glad that today we all convened here in order to discuss how to commemorate this building, which was much more than just a building. How to commemorate a symbol which for 300 years represented one of the most important Jewish communities of Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vladimir, for very, very interesting lecture. Are there any questions to Vladimir? Please.
Since the time that other synagogues appeared around. So you say, this is great, this is not. I think that it's, we can find it already from the 18th century, that it says the Groschul or the Stadtschul. Stadtschul, it's more 19th century.
Any other questions? So, Professor Katz?
On a minor point, is there any definitive knowledge of whether one of the Hasidic kloisen that you mentioned, was it Kedan or was it Kedanov?
Kaidanov, of course, Kaidanov, not Kindar, Chaz v'Chalila. Kaidanov. Today, Dzerzhinsk in Belarus.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, please, Professor Landsbergis.
Tell us, please, are there documentation compiled about decisions just after the war? As we see now, how those buildings and even synagogue was still staying alive and in beauty, and would make a decision to destroy it, to tear from the ground, are known decision makers with their names, signatures, and ranges.
Yeah, thank you. It's a wonderful question, and unfortunately, I never dealt with it. And I think this question should be addressed to the local researchers, to the people who study and research the Jewish Vilnius, maybe to the museum people. It's really we can just I can just imagine which ideas were behind the destruction of the whole complex. That you don't need it in this new capital of Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic, when you build it anew and you make new streets there. But I think there are people who are much more knowledgeable than me about this.
Could I add to Vladimir's answer something? You know the date. Yeah.
That the history of destruction is a part even of Holocaust, this material Holocaust.
Yes.
And
Yes.
to know everything.
Yeah, we should check in where is the mayor. He has the archive, I believe.
Just a second. I would like to add something to Vladimir's answer. I was also, you know, it's a very interesting question, and I discussed with other historians, because the dates when it was ruined, 55, 57, 1955, 57, it coincides with the dates when other synagogues in Soviet Union, in the western part of Soviet Union, were either reconstructed or razed. And there was a kind of campaign of documenting them. We have measure drawings of those years, and after that some of them were reconstructed and some razed. Probably there was a kind of decision on the very top of the Soviet hierarchy to do something with that, just or to bring it, to make a kind of a storage or club or whatever, or erase. This is my working hypothesis, but I'm not sure that you can resolve this problem on the local level, of the
So
local
you send
level
us from
research.
the mayor's archives here to the archives in Moscow.
Probably.